We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are... And, okay, there's the problem. I mean, there are multiple problems here, right? It's a problem that Jefferson seemed to think women weren't created equal. It's a problem that he owned African American slaves. But our problem this week is when it comes to naming those certain inalienable rights. Because if universal human rights are, a real thing, then we should be able to agree on what they are, right? Like, they should be self-evident. But when we look around at the world today, we see people love human rights, but they can't agree about them. Questions about universal human rights. What are they? Where do they come from? Can we agree about them? And if not, what do we do about that? You'll get all sorts of definitions, but according to the UN, human rights are A, universal, meaning they apply to everyone, everywhere, at all times, regardless of nationality, gender, culture, religion, language. And B, they are inalienable, meaning they cannot be sacrificed or compromised or traded away, because they rest on a solid foundation of... This is where it gets messy. According to Jefferson, they came from God, or the Creator. But not everybody believes in God, and different religious traditions would probably come up with different lists of God-given rights. Some people argue that we can derive human rights just from pure reason, or based on our common human nature. But human nature has been kind of a mixed bag, and pure reason has not reliably led to any sort of consensus. So all this raises the question of whether universal rights are even a real thing. I mean, maybe all this talk about rights is just meaningless noise. In fact, in the 18th century, the philosopher Jeremy Bentham argued, quote, "Natural rights is simple nonsense. Natural and imprescriptible rights, rhetorical nonsense. Nonsense upon stilts." Now, more recently, the Scottish philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, who I like a lot, even though I usually disagree with him, he argued, quote, "There are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and unicorns." But it doesn't end there. Now, you've all read Cosmopolitanism, so you know that Appiah argues for the primacy of practice. In other words, as a practical matter, who cares if we can't agree about what the foundations of human rights are, or even if they have foundations? So long as we can broadly, more or less, sort of agree about how those rights should be realized in practice, we're fine. I don't know. Well, look, a lot of scholars divide up human rights into three major groups, sometimes called dimensions or levels or generations. And often, when you encounter a big conflict between different visions of human rights, what's really happening is a dispute over which dimension should take precedence. Dimension 1 is civil and political rights. Think about the American Bill of Rights here. Things like freedom of speech and assembly, equality before the law, freedom from arbitrary arrest or cruel and unusual punishment. We often call this group the negative rights because they're all about restricting the power of the state, enumerating all the things that the government can't or shouldn't do to its citizens. Dimension 2 is social and economic rights. In the American context, think about the New Deal or the Great Society. Things like the right to public education, the right to employment at a fair wage, the right to health care or social security. Now, we often refer to this group as the positive rights because they're about all the social and economic goods that the government is required to provide. All the things the state must do for its citizens. Dimension 3 is collective and developmental rights. Things like the right of a community to maintain its own language and traditions and cultural heritage over time. Think about the collective ownership rights that some indigenous groups maintain over their traditional lands. Or the rights that French Canadians have to government support for French language education and public media. Now, as with the Dimension 2 group, these are mostly positive rights. That is, they're things that the government is required to provide. But what's different here is that the holder of the right isn't just an individual, it's a whole community, sometimes a whole ecosystem. So what happens when these different dimensions bump up against each other? Our government criticizes China for its violation of basic civil rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, due process, Dimension 1. No, responds the Chinese government. The real fundamental rights, the rights that people actually care about, are economic. The right to a secure living, to an education, to employment, to housing. Dimension 2. And then they ask how a country as wealthy as the United States can deprive so many of its citizens of these fundamental social goods. Who's right? A Western magazine publishes a cartoon denigrating the Prophet Muhammad. Muslim groups protest, accusing the magazine of insensitivity and even blasphemy. The magazine accuses the protesters of trying to violate its right to freedom of the press. Dimension 1. Then the protesters accuse the magazine of violating their collective rights to practice their traditional religion free from denigration and defamation. Dimension 3. Who's right? Even in cases where it's very clear to us that one group is responsible for major, blatant human rights violations, like genocide, even then, people make rights-based arguments on both sides. So whether it's extremist Serbs in Bosnia, or extremist Hutus in Rwanda, or extremist Buddhists in Myanmar, or even, hey, extremist Southern whites in 19th century America, they all argued that their basic collective rights to maintain and protect their traditional communities and traditional ways of life were under threat from hostile outsiders, and that they had to respond to defend themselves. You don't have to accept that reasoning. I mean, obviously, I hope you don't, right? The point is, it's not clear that we can reach even the most basic sorts of agreement about what human rights are or how they should work. I don't have the faintest idea.